Alrighty, guys. This is actually a really interesting chapter. So I should say we're starting Module 7, and so we're into now Chapter 10, which is oddly labeled Gestalt and Social Psychology. So I never, until I taught this course for the first time, I never saw a connection between Gestalt psychology, which is often very perception kind of oriented, and social psychology. They seem like very different things to me. But as it was presented in this textbook, and especially against the backdrop of the history of psychology, it makes sense. So that's the kind of journey we're going to do through this chapter. It'll cover a whole bunch of ground psychologically, but it all hangs together in terms of the critical defining feature of Gestalt psychology. So let's start here. Wertheimer and Gestalt psychology. So this is, we talked about behaviorism as one sort of reaction to Freud. And that was really very much the North American reaction. In Europe, a lot of the more scientific-minded psychologists started to become interested in this issue of Gestalt psychology. So it's kind of like this. It's kind of like they went back to the Fechner and Weber times, and they, as the sort of good old days, that's when we were collecting data and had nice little, just noticeable difference curves and Weber fractions, and it seemed like we were learning something about the mind, I guess. But Gestalt psychologists are not going to be so worried about the mind. They're going to be much more functional. So it's less about, what's consciousness look like, and much more about how does it work and what's it doing. But it's not even about consciousness. It's about how does perception work, really, with a lot of Gestalt stuff. So let's just kind of get into that right away, shall we? So first of all, boo Freud. These people, again, like many experimental-minded psychologists, just thought Freud was a big distraction that gathered a whole bunch of attention and made people think this is what psychology was about. But to most of the experimental psychologists, that was not what psychology was about. And there was no testable theories in anything Freud did. So once again, there was this, okay, we have to be more scientific. So I think, we can say that's what Freud really did. It's like people were kind of loose in their language, and then Freud was the ultimate loose in his language, creating all these unconscious id, ego, superego, all these principles, all this whatever, that could never be tested experimentally. So a lot of the experimentalists were like, whoa, we got to get back to science, because Freud is not science. Okay, and so they really focused back on perception, but they brought a twist to it that's changed a lot of the way we think about psychology. So to a Gestalt psychologist, they would love something like this figure on the right. And if I ask you, what do you see when you see that figure on the right? Do you see a three-dimensional cube just kind of hovering in the air there? If you do, very cool. You should be able to. So first of all, let me say Gestalt psychology will embrace this notion of phenomenology. And we got to get the difference between introspection here. Phenomenology is what this looks like to you. Okay, so when you look at that, do you see a cube, rather? And I hope you do. I mean, I certainly do. When I look at it, I see a cube. So phenomenologically, what we experience is a cube. That may not be aligned with what's out there in the real world. In fact, there is no cube out there in that real world. What there is a bunch of circles with little lines in them. In fact, if you put your hand over and you just kind of look at one of the circle at a time, just look at each circle one at a time, and then you'll see what it really is. That's what it really is just a black circle with some white lines through it. That's what's really out in the real world. But it's set up in just a certain way that the mind now pulls this cube out and sees this three-dimensional cube that is not there. That is what the Gestalt psychologists thought was the magic of perception. So Gestalt, there is no really good translation. It's a German word, but as close as we can come is sort of the whole is more than the sum of its parts. They will, as you'll see, they will talk about unified fields. They will talk about systems, and so the idea is when our eyes look at this. Well, let me do it this way. Let's contrast it. We've talked about this a few times in the course, the issue of reductionism. And some early psychologists have really embraced it. An example would be Wundt himself, who was trying to get to the simplest elements of consciousness, because he believed that once we understand what those simple elements are, that everything else in conscious experience is built by combining these simple things together. So just like a car, we can imagine all the little simple bits of a car, but if they're combined in just the right way, they produce a car. And what that means is you can take a car and you could sort of do the reverse, right? You could take it apart, and what you would be left with is just a bunch of pieces. And so that car just emerges when the pieces are constructed in a certain way. Similarly, in chemistry, where reductionism has been highly successful, the idea is we can reduce everything in the world, all the matter, to a few simple elements. But these elements combine in certain ways and create chemical structures. But still, down on the bottom of it is this basic elements that we just build to get the more complex version. Okay, so that's called reductionism. Gestalt psychology is going to say this is not the way we interact with the world. We are not just looking for simple features out in the world. And as we detect those features, we do detect features. I don't know if you know the work of Hubel and Wiesel. We'll come up with those at some point. But we do have parts of our brain that detect the features. So certainly that is happening. There are basic features. We're detecting them and we're starting to figure out what's there. But as we start to figure out what's there are other processes that we'll call top-down processes, processes based on our previous experience of what we've seen or not. And they will start interacting with that sort of bottom-up, that sort of reductionist kind of analysis of the world. And they will shape what we ultimately see. So if I go back here, yes, there's just basic lines and black and white out there. But as you start to perceive these, your brain notices that, hey, this line is perfectly in line with this line. And usually things I've seen out in the world, when that's true, there is still a continuation of that line. It's just usually occluded by something. You don't see it. But the brain starts to assume that these lines continue, something we're going to call good continuation. And so it kind of joins up all these lines, even though they're not really joined. And it creates this new object that is an object like we've seen. So for our brain, we can look at this as this odd three-dimensional cube that's sort of sitting on top of a bunch of black circles. Or we can see a bunch of black circles with various lines going different ways that look odd. The first approach is the simpler one. It makes more sense. It's more aligned with what the brain has seen before. And that's kind of the story we're going to tell. That the brain, when it's interacting with the external world, samples the external world, but very quickly it wants to see things it's seen before, things it's experienced before. And so there is this now interaction from high level and low level processes that ultimately determine what we phenomenologically observe. Okay, let's just give you some examples. Yeah, so we have this raw sensory processing from the bottom, and there we could imagine a sort of reductionist kind of approach being applied, where we, again, assume basic features that we're sensing and that we're combining, but we also have the meaning of what we're perceiving, which comes from memory, right? We've interacted with all of these objects before. And the Gestalt point is we do not just move from the raw processing up to memory, but rather that memory is part of this processing. It gets in there early, and it is biasing how we ultimately see what we see. So we're not just seeing what's out there, but the brain is doing a whole bunch of processing to allow us to get through all the noise of the world. And I'll make that point too a couple of ways. So from, what we're starting to introduce here is that perception and other things, as you'll see, do not happen as a simple additive kind of processing where you detect elements and build them up, but rather higher levels of our mind affect the elements that are perceived and how they are constructed. Okay, so there's a lot of bias from the past determining how we perceive the present. Let's think about it that way. So let me just show you some examples. And I don't know if these will all work for you, but I'll try. Do you recognize this person? For any of you who watch TV much, this is Judge Judy. So maybe you'll recognize her, maybe you don't. You have to have seen Judge Judy on TV. But if you have seen Judge Judy on TV, the question is, well, how can you see or hear? It's such a mess of stuff over here. But the brain, this is why the brain uses higher level things to help it deal with what it's seeing in the world, because we're always seeing a noisy input. That person's face is sometimes occluded by a mask, let's say, in the modern COVID era, or by sunglasses, or this person's wearing a hat, or they're walking behind something and you're only seeing part of them. We only ever get part of an input, but our brain is really good at figuring out what that is, because it's kind of like it's scanning the input for things that it's seen before. And when it starts to detect a little bit of something it's seen before, it kind of cleans it up. Okay, and it cleans it up in a bunch of cool ways. So in this case, it's literally helping you see through all this noise and seeing the Judge Judy that's underneath kind of emerges, right? Because of your memory. In a case like this, we're going to talk about the simplifying principle in a moment. But in a case like this is a lot like the cube I just showed you a moment ago. But the point here is, when you ask most people phenomenologically, what do you see? Most people will say, I see a white triangle over another black line triangle. And the top triangle, by the way, also lays across 3 circles. Okay. When in reality, what's out there is just 3 Pac-Men and 3 sort of greater than, less than signs. In reality, that's all that's out there. But the brain doesn't see a whole lot of Pac-Men, and it doesn't see a whole lot of greater and less than signs, but it does see triangles and circles on a regular basis. And so for the brain, the preferred perception of this is 2 triangles and 3 circles. And that makes sense to it. A triangle laying on top of these other ones. And that is how the brain kind of makes sense of this input, even though that's not what the input is really at all. But the past experience, it wants to see things kind of like the past. Okay. So those were examples from perception. Let's do a couple of examples from language. I usually in a class, I would just ask people read this out loud as quick as they can, but I'll just do it. It doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are, the sentence is still readable. You've seen these examples online, and it's truly impressive. But this is the exact same thing. The brain is being exposed to things like this that are not consistent with stuff it's seen before, but it doesn't see it like that. It sees it like something that seems like it fits with memory. And that doesn't just mean the word itself, but once we start getting words, we have a higher level context, right? It doesn't matter. And now we start to expect certain things to follow from it doesn't matter. And so we have all our grammar rules that kind of lead our brain to expect certain things. And very quickly, the brain just cleans this up. And what we phenomenologically see is stuff that fits with what we've seen before. Okay, again, because this high level process is interpreting the input and making it sensical to us. Here's another example I like to do. I'm just going to ask you to do this silently. I'm going to throw this thing up. You're going to read it, and then I'm going to make it disappear, and I'm going to ask you how many words there is here. You ready? There it is. Look at that for a little while. Okay, how many words did you just see? So some of you will say 6. How many say 6? Raise your hands. Did you really raise your hand? That's cool if you really did. You're wrong. There's not 6. There's 7. Try again. And this time I'm going to put it back on and see how long it takes you to agree with me. So when you just read it to yourself, you almost always read it as, I love Paris in the springtime, which is 6 letters, which is 6 words. But in reality, it says, I love Paris in the springtime. Your brain removes one of the thes because it doesn't make sense to have two thes. And so the brain just removes one. So what are we seeing here? If we kind of go back here, the brain will see through a bunch of, somehow clean up stuff that's in a bunch of noise. It will see things that aren't even there to make something make more sense, to be more of a simple experience for us. It will completely, once again, kind of get through noise. In this case, reorder letters in a word in order to make it make sense. It will delete words from a sentence to make that sentence make sense. And this is the kind of thing the brain does. Okay, so this is what Gestalt psychologists really liked. Now, the original demonstration, I don't dare click on this right now because when I click on YouTube videos, sometimes my videos get blocked from being shown. So I'm not going to do that. But suffice it to say, all that this does is Wertheimer, Max Wertheimer was the one that started pushing this. And he started with a simple demonstration. So he would have this light turn on and then off, and this one turn on and then off, and then this one turn on and off. So this switch would switch them. What that would result in is when this light's on, there's a rod. So you'd see a shadow here. And then that shadow would turn off. And this light turns on and you would see a shadow there. And then it would turn off. And so, really what you should see are two lines, this line turning on and off, and this line turning on and off. But as you'll see when you click on the demo, that's not what it feels like. Phenomenologically, again, what it feels like is this line is jumping over here and jumping back over here and jumping back over here and jumping back over here. We get an illusion of apparent motion. And this relates to this idea called the minimum principle, where what was suggested by Wertheimer is once again, the brain's trying to make sense of it, and it makes more sense to the brain that one line is jumping around, especially if the timing is right, that one line is jumping around rather than two lines that are turning on and off. That's a more complicated thing, right? Two lines, this one turning on and off, and this one turning on and off. That's a more complex reality than just something bouncing around. And so the brain wants to see it in a simple way that fits with things it's seen. So other people had known about this illusion, but Wertheimer was the one that said, this is telling us something about the brain and the fact that the brain is not treating this experience like individual events, but rather as an overall experience. And that perception of the overall experience is affecting how the individual elements are perceived. And so this is what we really mean by Gestalt, the sort of whole affecting the way the parts are seen. Okay, and it suggests a much more complex notion of how the brain is processing information, a much more interactive notion where things like memory interact with things like perception. Okay, so it was like, whoa. Now, a lot of their demonstrations were originally very simple, and they worked on a couple of issues to begin with to try to get at the magic of how these things were happening. And the first thing they tried to do is pose some Gestalt laws of organization. So one of the things they said that's really important is something called grouping. Why, when we look out into the world, do certain things get grouped together? Like, look at my face. There's all these different colors and things, and yet all of this gets grouped together as my head and my face. Even these headphones coming out now are all sort of part of that. But certainly my nose and my ears and my mouth and my chin, that's certainly all part of my face. And so when you're looking at somebody, you have to first figure out, well, what's their face? What parts of those are their face? And then I look at that and I might try to recognize it. So they talked about certain ways in which things get grouped together and start to feel like they belong together. One of them was proximity. So if we start with these 8 dots, simply by moving certain pairs close to one another, these start to feel like they go together, right? So we feel like we have 4 pairs. We can do that by moving 2 closer together, but we can also do it just with color. 2 black, 2 white, 2 black, 2 white, and suddenly the blacks seem to go together and the whites ones seem to go together. So once again, the system wants to group by these things. What do you see when you look at this? The claim in the textbook is that you'll tend to see one line that kind of goes this way and another line that kind of goes this way, and that they intersect. And that's supposed to be this notion of good continuation, that when a line looks like it could continue, that's what we kind of see it as doing. So in this case, we might not see two figures abutting. We might, in fact, see two lines crossing, like an X. But here, once we put that little voot there, now we have closure, and that makes that look like an object. So now it feels like we have two objects abutting. At any rate, you'll get an example of this. They're just trying to show how things can produce grouping, and so that we can start to figure out, okay, that's all part of one object. And that's one of the issues that they worked on quite a bit. They also worked a lot on figure versus ground. They're trying to, again, try to get at the magic of perception. They said, well, one of the things, even once you figure out what the objects are out there, now when you're focusing on something, you got to figure out what part of that is the actual object and what part of it is the background that the object falls within. And these are just sort of fun mess with your head things. So this first one you've probably seen before. So you can either see it as two black faces with sort of nose to nose, or you can see a white vase in the middle, and you can kind of flip this in your mind, right? You can see it one way and then see it the other way, and then see it one way and then see it the other way. Kind of cool. Yes, Kathy, thank you with your large glasses. Excellent. I should have prevented that from happening. Sorry. What about this one? Well, this one you can either see as Batman, which is most obvious here, where you have the black Batman figure, and now the yellow seems like background. But if we just turn this upside down, that's what we got over here. And now you have this sort of penguin figure sitting over here, and the black part seems like background. So, with these same figures, you can flip them back and forth, and suddenly something else feels background or not. This one's, by the way, a real head messer when you get it. Most people right away see these little pillars, these sort of white pillars, but wait for it for a little bit and look at the black stuff and try to make it foreground. And suddenly you'll see what look like a bunch of people, sort of kids, with their heads sort of down a little bit, looking at one another. And when they pop out, it kind of makes you go, whoa. But notice that the white suddenly becomes the background when you do that. And the black part becomes the foreground. Escher was an artist who used to love playing with these sorts of effects. He did a lot of artwork where he kept changing what was background and foreground. Okay, so this was a core part of what the Gestalt people figured out. They thought it was something that had to happen very early on in the processing thing, because once you figure out what the object is, then you can start processing it and trying to recognize it. And of course, for something like this, memory is key. Like, if you've never seen Batman before, you're probably going to have a lot of trouble recognizing that figure at all. But if you've seen Batman, you know those sort of features. So as you start to perceive those features, the top-down things are kind of going, that's Batman. And then they're emphasizing the Batman features, etc. Okay. So that's the introduction to Gestalt psychology. That gets you talking about this overall system. Now let's take it from there and watch how this grows into a much bigger area in psychology, including social psychology. Cool. Leaving it there then.